The I-70 killer claimed 6 lives in a span of less than 30 days. He struck in broad daylight and was spotted by several witnesses who noted his creepy demeanor and large gun. His thrill kills targeted brunette retail employees working in small shops at strip malls along the highway. He scouted his locations and never took much money, but despite this clear and distinct MO, many police departments were slow to catch on. And this was largely due to the fact that the I-70 killer took his act on the road. His route took him back and forth all across the Midwest, each kill hundreds of miles from the last. Join me along his route from I-70 in Kansas City to Wichita, a portion of his raging road trip that has divided detectives from the very start. Why Wichita? Why zigzag across these states? Some investigators believe that he was a hitchhiker, catching rides to and from each crime scene, but others believe that he must have had a vehicle of his own, hidden somewhere. What other things could he be hiding? What secrets is the serial killer keeping? Come along on this trip with me. Let's take a look at the first 30 days and the few things that we do know about the infamous I-70 killer. It all started in Indianapolis, Indiana, on April 8, 1992. 26-year-old Robin Fuldauer hadn't been scheduled to work that day, but her coworker, the only other full-time employee, had called in sick. Known for her work ethic and her responsible nature, Robin, who managed the Payless shoe store on Pendleton Pike, stepped up and reported to work. The Payless was the store at the end of a strip mall directly off the exit ramp of Highway 465, which connected to I-70. There was a Speedway gas station next door, and it was the gas station attendant who noticed that something was amiss at the Payless. When she entered the store that afternoon, it was empty. She saw that the cash register had been left open, and assuming that there had been a robbery, left quickly to call 911. The gas station attendant did not notice Robin's body, which was later located laying on the floor in a back room. Robin Fuldauer had been shot once in the back of the head. Described as kind, warm, and caring, Robin had 2 older sisters and attended Indiana University. She enjoyed outdoor sports like tennis, boating, and sailing. Her life was cut short that day, and her killer had taken just $90 from the register. Detectives got started right away, searching for clues, taking fingerprints, and looking for witnesses. There were no cameras in the store, but investigators thought Robin had been shot at around 1:30 p.m. They told Fox 59 that in the hour or so between Robin's death and her discovery, that several customers had come into the store and left with pairs of stolen shoes. Jeff Mayrose was the manager of a paint shop across the street, and he reported seeing a strange man lurking in the area several hours before Robin was found dead. Jeff assumed that the man was a hitchhiker and said that his clothes were dirty and that he had carried a large duffel bag. He also reported that the man appeared to be talking to himself and giggling, which just feels really creepy. Jeff saw the man circle the area several times before sitting on the concrete curb outside of a nearby burger restaurant. There he sat for at least 30 minutes. He watched. He waited before heading into the shoe store where Robin was working alone. Just minutes later, the killer was seen fleeing out the back door. Jeff worked with a sketch artist to create this image, and several witnesses came forward with reports of a strange man matching the killer's description seen trying to hitch a ride in no apparent hurry. Mike Crook was the first homicide detective on the case. There was no apparent motive, with so little taken from the register, But given the eyewitness accounts and all of the people in the area, he recalled thinking that someone would call in with their suspect. Someone would call in with something. But the phone lines quieted quickly, leaving the detective with little to go on. The I-70 killer had already moved on. The next killing happened only 3 days later, but 700 miles away, at a formal wear and bridal shop in Wichita, Kansas. 32-year-old Patricia Majors and her husband Mark had purchased La Bride d'Elegance just the previous year in 1991. It was directly off of US 54 and just a couple of miles from Interstate 35. Patricia, who went by Trish, really enjoyed running the shop. She loved helping people look their best and never worried much about the money. April 11th had been a busy day, with many customers stopping in to pick up suits or dresses for proms and prepping for summer weddings. Trish Majors had been joined by a junior associate, 23-year-old Patricia Smith. Patricia was a bridal consultant who also enjoyed working at the store, but did so part-time and was studying nursing. When she graduated, Patricia Smith ultimately wanted to work with babies. And just for clarity, yes, both women were named Patricia, but the store owner typically went by the name Trish, which is how I'll be referring to her from here on out. That evening, the two women stayed at the bridal shop later than usual. A customer needed to pick up a cummerbund, but wasn't able to get there until after close that day, after 6 p.m. When that customer arrived at the shop, the two employees that he expected to greet him were gone. Instead, the young man encountered a stranger, a thin, white man standing menacingly near the front of the store. The customer described him as unkempt, with stubble on his face and reddish blonde hair. He was wearing a short brown jacket and was carrying something wrapped up in a bridal veil. Confused, the customer quickly realized that that something was a gun. Confronted by the unexpected customer after closing, the gunman asked the customer to follow him into a back room. Shocked and scared, the customer wisely refused, backing slowly out of the store. Investigators believe that doing so saved the young man's life, and that he certainly would have been shot had he followed the gunman to the rear of the building. Terrified, the customer waited an hour before calling 911 to report the armed man. Police, who arrived at the shop, found both women in a back room. Each had been shot in the head. Sadly, Trish Majors was found deceased, but Patricia Smith was somehow still alive. An ambulance was called and she was rushed to the nearest hospital. While police were investigating the crime, both Trish and Patricia's worried husbands arrived at the store. Norman Smith had expected Patricia home by 6:15. When she hadn't arrived by then, he correctly assumed that she must have stayed late for a customer. He waited until 7, and when she still hadn't arrived at home, he called the store but got no answer. That was when he had decided to drive to the shop. Police sent Norman to St. Joseph's Medical Center, the hospital where Patricia had been transported to by ambulance. But by the time that he arrived, she had sadly passed. It is heartbreaking for the cummerbund customer to realize that the hour he waited to call for help could have been one filled with life-saving medical assistance for Patricia, and he is described as being emotionally wrecked. Thankfully, though, the customer's own life was spared, and he could provide valuable information to authorities about the killer. He described the man as being 5'7" tall, 150 pounds, and in his 30s or 40s. A composite sketch was made and distributed. Police interviewed Patricia's husband, Norman, and Tricia's husband, Mark, that evening, but quickly determined that neither were involved. A small amount of cash was missing from the register, but investigators wondered, who would target a bridal store. There had been a triple homicide 6 years earlier at another formal wear store in Kansas City. Both shops had been licensed by the same franchise, Sir Knight, and both were served by the same warehouse, Anderson Tuxedo Rentals. Detectives explored the possibility that the two slayings could be connected, but quickly came up empty-handed. Once news broke of Trish and Patricia's murder, an extraordinary amount of tips were called in. Detectives and uniformed officers alike stayed busy for days, taking in phone calls and following up on leads. Officials briefly considered BTK, a serial killer who had haunted Wichita off and on for decades. But these killings bore no resemblance to BTK's typical MO, which often included restraints and hours of torture. In contrast, the I-70 killer's murders were nearly instant, with little fanfare or warning. Guns are an abnormal choice of weapon for a serial killer. Many, like BTK, opt for something more up close and personal, like strangulation or stabbing. At the time, no one in Wichita suspected that a whole new serial killer had come to town. But just as quickly as he'd arrived, he was gone, on the road again. Two weeks later, the killer reappeared. This time, he was 600 miles east, back to Indiana. What caused the killer to return? Was there a specific reason to be back in Indiana, or a specific reason that he had gone to Kansas? The random change in direction is particularly frustrating for investigators who wondered, did the killer travel for work? Was there a trucking or a construction job that had him on the move? The killer appeared next at a small store in Terre, Haute called Sylvia's Ceramics. A customer found 40-year-old Michael McCown at about 4:30 that afternoon. He had been shot dead while stocking shelves in the shop, located on Highway 41 just a few blocks north of I-70. It is 80 miles west of Indianapolis and the killer's first attack. Michael, who went by Mick, was described as a good guy with a big grin. He loved music, playing bass guitar, and he sang. Mick was well-liked and helpful. He managed the ceramics store for his mother, Sylvia, and had been alone in the shop that afternoon. Shot in the back of the head, investigators don't think he even saw his killer's face. For some reason, Mick is the only victim that the I-70 killer did not take to a back room before being shot. He also happens to be the only male victim identified thus far. However, police are quick to point out that the killer may have believed that Mick was a woman for a variety of reasons. First, the name of the store, Sylvia's Ceramics, which implies that the shop is at least owned, if not also run by a woman. Second, Mick's ears were pierced, and his long brown hair was nearly waist length and pulled back into a ponytail. Mick's older sister points out that Mick's body type was not at all feminine. He was quite tall, though his height may have been missed, given that he was shot while kneeled down near the ground, stocking a lower shelf. Regardless, police in Terre Haute, like their predecessors in Indianapolis and Wichita, were baffled by the apparent lack of motive in Mick's killing. His wallet was missing, but there was money left in his pocket and in the register. Mick, like the others, also isn't involved in any local crime. He doesn't have money problems or a contentious divorce, nothing suspicious or concerning to a homicide investigator. When police look into these victims' lives, they aren't finding any leads, and they aren't coming up with any suspects. The next death is just 6 days later. The killer has traveled west on I-70 again, nearly 200 miles to St. Charles, Missouri. Boot Village was a Western wear store in the Bogey Hills Shopping Center that opened at noon that Sunday. It was a slow afternoon, and 24-year-old Nancy Kitzmiller had been working the shop by herself. Nancy was described as friendly, but shy, intelligent, and driven. She loved country music, silver jewelry, and line dancing. She had played soccer for Oklahoma State and had just graduated with a degree in geography. Nancy had loved maps ever since she was a child and had just moved back to the St. Louis area for a job that was lined up at the National Defense Mapping Agency, which is now known as the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. It was a dream job for Nancy, but it required an extensive background check. And so in the meantime, she was making her living as a manager at the Boot Village, where she got to help people find something else she loved: cowboy boots. In just a few weeks, Nancy would have been at her new job, meeting new people, building a career. But instead, two customers found Nancy in the back of the store, shot in the head. This time, all of the money in the register had been taken. Again, it is an execution-style kill in broad daylight, at a small store in a shopping center off of the highway. Boot Village had only been open for a few hours, so police interviewed customers and spoke with a woman who had seen a suspicious man in the store earlier that day. And she worked with a sketch artist to create these composite sketches. Detectives in St. Charles saw the unique circumstances of this crime and took initiative in calling around to law enforcement in other areas. Nancy's murder wasn't a result of a robbery gone wrong. It wasn't a revenge killing or a crime of passion. It was a cold, calculated thrill kill, and it wasn't the only one. In fact, nearly a month into their investigation, police in Indianapolis and in Wichita had come to the same conclusion. Both departments were calling around looking for similar killings in other cities. They had exchanged their suspect sketch and suspect descriptions, which did share a lot of similarities. Slowly, the dots were starting to connect, but the I-70 killer was still a step ahead. Investigators were finally making headway, but the same day that a ballistics comparison matched two of the crimes, another woman was killed. Raytown, Missouri, is a suburb of Kansas City, more than 200 miles west of St. Charles on I-70. Only 4 days after Nancy Kitzmiller was shot dead, the I-70 killer struck again, this time taking the life of 37-year-old Sarah Blessing. Sarah and 5 of her friends co-owned a boutique in the Woodson Valley Shopping Center called the Store of Many Colors. This shop sold things like incense, herbal remedies, and crystals, and it had only been open for 3 weeks. It had been a dream come true for Sarah and her friends to open this shop, and they each took turns working shifts there. Thursday, May 7th, was Sarah's turn. Sarah Blessing was described as a health nut who loved gardening, nature, and wellness. She liked to write poetry and had recently finished a children's book. She also was just really happy to be working at the Store of Many Colors, sharing her knowledge with her community and taking on this adventure of store ownership with her friends. At about 6:15 that evening, Tim Hickman, the owner of the video store next door, saw a suspicious man through his shop window. And I should note that it was still light out. Sunset in Kansas City happens after 8 o'clock this time of year, so Tim didn't have any trouble getting a good look at this guy. The man stood out as odd. It had been a warm day, with temperatures reaching the low 70s, but this man was wearing a heavy wool jacket. He looked Tim in the eye on his way past. Minutes later, Tim heard a gunshot. He ran outside just in time to see the man heading in the other direction. Tim said that the man had looked cool and calm, like he didn't have a care. Clutching his own gun for protection, Tim rushed into the Store of Many Colors, where, he saw Sarah's feet protruding from a back room. Quickly, he called 911. While to this day, Tim still feels a tremendous amount of guilt for not confronting that man, he was able to assist authorities with the creation of another suspect sketch and additional descriptions of the killer. Tim described the perpetrator as in his mid-30s, 5'7" tall, and with a slender to medium build. He had light brown or auburn-colored hair, and Tim described his coat as being gray herringbone. Tim may have felt guilty for not realizing what was going on right away, but he had actually acted quite quickly and made a good note of the suspect and his appearance. Tim had received no warning that a serial killer was on the loose, targeting retail employees. At this time, investigators were just putting the pieces together. The story broke publicly 2 days later, on Saturday, May 9th. They called him the I-70 killer right from the start. And actually, when news breaks, the ballistics tests have not yet come back on the 2 Wichita murders. Many articles published that morning attribute the killer with only 4 kills: Robin and Mick in Indiana, and Nancy and Sarah in Missouri. Mike Crook, the initial homicide investigator from the Indianapolis Police Department, was skeptical that the bridal shop killings were connected, and is quoted as saying, "The Wichita shootings appear to be too far off of I-70. Wichita is really hot on the idea that they are involved, but we are not." Unquote. Detective Crook had other reasons to be skeptical. The bridal shop was the only location where the killer murdered 2 victims and nearly a third. It is also the only killing that occurred after the store had closed. However, Detective Crook is soon proved wrong, and the tests show that the same .22 caliber weapon was used in each of the killings. Based on both ballistics evidence and witness statements, police believed that the gun was either an Intratec Scorpion or an Irma Werke model ET-22, though at the time, they keep this information to themselves. The news of the serial killer made headlines across the nation. He was a relentless thrill seeker, killing innocent retail workers mid-shift for no apparent reason. Though money is missing from most of the stores, robbery was not considered to be the motive behind the shootings. The killing was. Lieutenant Mike Hennessy, lead homicide investigator from Wichita, told the Associated Press, "Killing was the motivation, no doubt in my mind." Major Pat Marici from the St. Louis Police Department said, quote, "I guess evidently he must need some money to move around. But the sad part is that people are getting killed. I think he will continue to do it until he gets caught." Unquote. But as soon as the news breaks about the murders, the killings stopped. I'm not sure any of the detectives expected the killer to be scared off by a little publicity. Of course, all killers are unique, but again, to contrast BTK, he personally wrote to newspapers to bring attention to his crimes. The I-70 killer certainly wasn't that type, but he also hadn't appeared too worried or concerned about being seen, meeting Tim Hickman's eye, and letting that unnamed Cumberland customer go. He had to have known that word would get out. But for whatever reason, as soon as the news breaks and those sketches of his face were printed, the killing spree ended. He hadn't been caught and wasn't going to be. Decades of investigation were still to come, and even more murders. Were they the work of the I-70 killer? Some think so, but many disagree. Join me next time for part 2. The I-70 road trip continues with a look at the rest of the investigation, the profiles, theories, and other deaths that have divided detectives for years.